The first thing Marcus Webb noticed wasn't the smell of rot or the way the fence sagged like a tired old man leaning on a cane. It was the bees, 3 of them, hovering in a tight, deliberate triangle above a patch of cracked earth near the northeast corner of the orchard, a spot where nothing had grown in years. They weren't foraging. They weren't drifting the way bees do when the wind carries them. They were circling, waiting, as if they were guarding something. Marcus stood very still, holding his breath, watching. A bee will tell you the truth before a person ever will, and these bees were telling him something was wrong, or something was hidden. He didn't know which yet. He crouched down. The ground beneath the circling bees was harder than the soil around it, almost like stone pressed just beneath the surface. He pressed his palm flat against it. Cool. Colder than it should have been on a July afternoon with the sun beating down on his back. Somewhere behind him, an old irrigation pipe groaned in the wind, though there hadn't been water running through it in a decade. He hadn't touched that pipe. Nobody had touched anything on this land in 10 years. So why did it just move? If stories about resilience, hidden truths, and the extraordinary people who chase them speak to you, subscribe now. There's a lot more waiting for you here. And before we go further, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? 6 weeks earlier, Marcus had stood in a different spot on this same land, holding a piece of paper that said he now owned 11 acres of dead orchard for the price of a tank of gas. $20. That was the final bid at the county auction, after every other buyer in the room had laughed, shaken their heads, and let it go. The Hollis orchard had been abandoned for over a decade, half its trees dead standing, the other half so overgrown with blackberry bramble that you couldn't see where one row ended and the next began. The soil, according to the last agricultural report on file, was non-productive, acidic, and unsuitable for commercial cultivation. Nobody wanted it. Nobody except a 34-year-old former mechanic with a bad knee, a dead father who used to talk about orchards the way other men talked about baseball, and exactly $4,000 left in his savings account. "You're going to lose your shirt on that place," his neighbor Dell had told him, not unkindly, just stating what everyone assumed was obvious. Ground's been sour for years. County wanted to bulldoze it and put in storage units. Marcus hadn't answered. He couldn't have explained it if he tried, not in a way that would have made sense to Dell or to his sister or to anyone standing in the parking lot of the county courthouse that morning. His father, Ray Webb, had grown up on an orchard 3 states away, one that his own family lost in a bad decade of frost and debt. Ray talked about it his whole life, like a wound that never quite closed. The smell of the blossoms in April, the sound of his mother's ladder against the trunks, the particular gold of late-season apples catching the evening light. He died 2 years ago, having never owned another tree. Marcus wasn't trying to save an orchard. He was trying to finish something his father never got to. He just didn't expect it to be this hard. The first month was brutal. Clearing bramble with a borrowed brush cutter, discovering that half the irrigation lines had collapsed underground, finding trees so riddled with canker that the county extension agent recommended tearing out entire rows. He worked from before sunrise until his hands cramped shut, and some nights he sat on the porch of the falling-down farmhouse and wondered if Dell had been right. Then, on a Tuesday in early June, he noticed the bees weren't behaving normally. He'd bought 4 hives almost as an afterthought. His father used to say an orchard without bees is a graveyard with flowers, expecting them to do what bees always do, fan out, forage, come home. Instead, colony after colony kept drifting toward the same forgotten corner of the property, a section so overtaken with blackberry that Marcus hadn't even finished clearing it yet. At first he assumed it was something simple, wild blackberry blossom maybe, or clover. But when he finally hacked his way in with loppers and a machete, he found something that didn't belong in an abandoned corner of dead ground, a stand of wildflowers he didn't recognize, growing in a loose, deliberate ring, not scattered the way wildflowers usually are, but almost planted. Old. Older than the orchard's decline. Older, maybe, than the orchard itself. That was the small, impossible clue that changed everything. Marcus started paying closer attention after that, really watching, the way his father used to describe watching the sky before a frost. and the longer he watched, the stranger things became. The bees from Hive 2 kept coming home with pollen that was almost orange, a shade none of the surrounding rows should have produced. They flew low over that same northeast corner, lower than bees typically fly when foraging efficiently, as if they were following something at ground level rather than searching the treetops. And when Marcus finally harvested a small test batch of honey in July, it didn't taste like anything from the trees he'd planted or the brambles he'd cleared. It was mineral, almost smoky, with a long finish that reminded him, oddly, of stone. He mentioned it to nobody. Who would believe him? Dell would just laugh again, but he couldn't let it go. He started researching old orchard records at the county archive, sifting through brittle land deeds that hadn't been touched since the Hollis family gave up the property. Buried in a folder of unrelated paperwork, he found a hand-drawn survey map from nearly 90 years earlier, long before the Hollis family had even owned the land. It showed the property divided differently than it was now, with a small structure marked near that same northeast corner and a single faded word beside it: spring. There was no spring on the orchard now. The land had been bone dry for as long as anyone could remember, and the county's own soil reports called it non-productive and poorly drained, unless the two things were connected, unless the ground had once not been dry at all. That was when Marcus started to suspect the orchard's failure wasn't only about neglect. Something underneath the land itself had changed. He dug, carefully, methodically, over several evenings, right where the old map placed the spring, right where the bees kept circling. 2 feet down, his shovel struck stone, not natural rock, but cut stone, fitted together the way old well linings and cisterns were built a century ago. It was a capped spring, sealed and covered sometime in the past, its water diverted or lost, its existence apparently forgotten by everyone except a 100-year-old ring of wildflowers and, somehow, his bees. Reopening it wasn't simple. Groundwater moves, silts up, changes course over decades. Marcus spent 2 weeks with an old irrigation contractor named Pete, testing, clearing debris, running dye tests to trace where the water actually wanted to go now. What they found was almost unbelievable. A shallow aquifer vein still flowing beneath the property, its outlet blocked for generations, its water quietly rerouting itself underground toward the one section of soil that had somehow stayed alive enough all these years to support a ring of ancient wildflowers that no modern nursery catalog could identify. The orchard wasn't dead because the land was bad. It was dying because its water had been buried alive. For the first time since he'd signed the deed, Marcus let himself believe this could actually work. Then, in late August, everything fell apart. A storm rolled in from the coast faster than any forecast predicted, one of those late summer systems that meteorologists apologize for afterward. It brought straight-line winds that tore through the orchard for 11 brutal minutes and left behind a wreckage that took months to build and seconds to destroy. 14 of his healthiest young trees were snapped or uprooted. The reopened spring, still fragile and only partially channeled, flooded and collapsed the very trench Pete had spent 2 weeks carefully lining. Worse, 2 of his 4 hives were crushed beneath a fallen limb from the property's oldest tree, the one Marcus had privately nicknamed the Grandfather, because it reminded him of his father's stories. He stood in the wreckage the next morning in the gray, dripping light, and for the first time since the auction, he cried. Not because of the money, though the money was real, and the money was gone. He cried because he had let himself believe, just for a few weeks, that this place might actually forgive him for showing up too late. His sister called that week and gently suggested he cut his losses. "You gave it everything," she said. "Nobody would blame you for walking away." Marcus almost did. He sat on the porch step for 3 days doing nothing but staring at broken trees, and somewhere in that silence he thought about his father, standing years ago in front of foreclosure papers for an orchard 3 states away, and how Ray Webb had never gotten a second chance to stand in dirt like this and try again. Marcus decided he would not waste his. It was Dell, of all people, who mentioned the name that changed the next chapter of the story. "You want somebody who actually knows old orchard ground," Dell said one afternoon, watching Marcus haul broken limbs to a burn pile. You talked to Ruth Calloway. She kept bees and ran a fruit operation on the ridge for 40 years before her hip gave out. Ornery is a wet cat, but she knows things nobody bothers writing down anymore. Ruth Calloway turned out to be 78 years old, sharp as a blade, and entirely unimpressed by Marcus's story until he mentioned the wildflower ring and the orange pollen. Then she went quiet for a long moment. "That's old rootstock forage," she said finally. "Folks used to plant certain flowering plants around a water source on purpose, not for looks, for the bees. Kept pollinators concentrated near the healthiest ground, especially where the water ran mineral-rich. Your grandbees aren't discovering something new, son. They're remembering something old." She didn't fix his orchard for him. She wasn't that kind of guide. Instead, over the following months, she taught him to read the land the way she'd learned to read it, how to test soil pH by hand and smell rather than waiting on lab results, how certain fungal issues on his surviving trees were signs of drainage problems rather than disease to be sprayed away, how the mineral content bleeding up from his newly reopened spring was likely the very thing that had made the old orchard's fruit prize generations ago, before it was ever called non-productive by anyone with a clipboard. "Your bees found the truth before you did," she told him once, watching Hive 1 survivors work the reopened spring's edge. "That's what good bees do. They don't waste time on land that isn't worth the trip." Rebuilding took the better part of a year. Marcus relined the spring channel properly this time, with stone instead of plastic pipe, the way the century-old cistern had been built. He replanted the fallen trees with rootstock suited to the mineral-heavy soil Ruth helped him identify, rather than the generic nursery stock he'd started with out of ignorance. He expanded the wildflower ring instead of clearing it, letting his remaining bees do what they'd clearly been trying to tell him all along. There was no miracle harvest, no sudden windfall. Just, slowly, an orchard that started behaving like it wanted to live. By the following spring, blossoms came in thicker than the county extension agent had predicted possible for that ground. By the following autumn, Marcus stood at a small local farmer's market with crates of apples that carried a faint, unmistakable mineral sweetness, and buyers who came back the next week asking for more without knowing or caring why they tasted the way they did. Dell showed up at that market too, the first cool Saturday of October, and didn't say much beyond nodding at the crates and buying 2 bags for himself. Marcus stood in the orchard one evening the following spring, in almost the exact spot where he'd first watched 3 bees circle a patch of cracked, forgotten earth. The spring ran clear now, edged in wildflowers 100 years older than he was. The grandfather tree, scarred but alive, threw long shadows across rows that were finally, quietly, coming back to themselves. He thought about his father, about foreclosure papers signed decades ago on a different piece of land, about a man who spent the rest of his life describing orchards he never got to have again. Marcus hadn't rescued this place because he was smarter than the people who gave up on it, or luckier than the buyers who'd laughed at the auction. He'd rescued it because he'd been willing to stand still long enough to notice what the bees already knew, that beneath every piece of land people call worthless, there's sometimes just a truth waiting for someone patient enough to listen for it. The bees didn't circle anymore. They didn't need to. The water was free, the flowers were blooming, and the orchard his father never got to save was, in its own quiet and unhurried way, finally saving itself, one careful season at a time.